If you're a fan of One Piece and Jujutsu Kaisen, then you probably noticed this difference. Recently I said that Jujutsu Kaisen has better fights, but that wasn't the complete story. Because while I will admit that the fights in Jujutsu Kaisen are technically better due to things such as paneling and choreography, One Piece fights are better because of the investment and the payoff. And I already know what you're gonna say.
How am I gonna say a series that never kills its characters has good payoff?
Well, first off, JJK does the same thing, so meh. Second, while that may be true, the kind of payoff you get with some of these One Piece fights is godlike. So, in this video, I'd like to analyze the way Oda carefully builds up to these epic fights, thoughtfully crafts the different matchups, and structures the fights so that they're some of the most iconic fights in all of manga. So let's start by looking at how each series approaches matchups. In the case of Jujutsu Kaisen, you have some of the most legendary matchups in manga. Ouji versus Mahito, Gojo versus Toji, Toji versus the Zenin, Gojo versus Sukuna, Sukuna versus Ouji. But, obviously, these are only a fraction of the fights. Most of the fights are pretty random, and this is partly due to the fact that fights in Jujutsu Kaisen usually end as fast as they start. And this is going to be a recurring theme because, as you'll see, Jujutsu Kaisen tends to go for faster fights that are more intense at the expense of build-up and potential payoff. One Piece, on the other hand, is different. In One Piece, even if it doesn't get a ton of build-up, Oda will usually try to put some thought into making deliberate matchups. For example, Zoro, being a swordsman, will almost always be matched up against another swordsman. Part of it is just a logistic thing. I mean, why have a swordsman if he never fights other swordsmen? The other part is that doing so elevates our perception of Zoro and his skills. Like every time there's a new villain and oh, they're the master of the dizzy sword technique, or no, they're the strongest swordsman in the whatever crew. Every time Zoro beats these kinds of characters, it naturally elevates him in the story and makes him that much more badass. And that's the kind of payoff you don't always get in Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, it's not like I'm saying Jujutsu Kaisen fights don't have any payoff. That'd be a pretty stupid thing to say, considering it's one of the most popular battle shonen of all time. But look at the fights in, say, Shibuya or Culling Games. For example, one of my favorite fights in JJK is Yuta versus Uro and Ryu. One of the most random matchups in the entire series, but to this day it's still one of the best fights. One of the best examples of how you don't need super deliberate matchups to craft a good fight. But this is true for a lot of the fights in Jujutsu Kaisen. And in this case, when we look at payoff, nothing really besides getting a badass fight. Like if we say, what did this do for Yuta? All you can say is, well, it adds to his case of being a strong character. It's not quite the same as in One Piece being able to say that Zoro has now moved up in the world of swordsmen. Another benefit to matchups in One Piece being more deliberate is that you get a more diverse array of fights. In other words, you get a bunch of fights that all have a different vibe to them. So in Alabasta, Usopp and Chopper got the goofier fight. Nami got a fight where it was about using her climb attack instead of just using devil fruit powers like everyone else. And Zoro, like always, got the serious, badass fight. So the fights all have different flavors. In Jujutsu Kaisen, even in these battle royales, that's not really the case. Like, yeah, the characters all have different abilities. Like, you have characters like Hikari and Takaba who have some crazy powers. But for the most part, JJK fights all have basically the same vibe to them. Like, in JJK, all the fights will feel like a boxing match or a bunch of characters jumping another character. There is variety, but not to the extent that you see in One Piece, where one fight is super serious and all about strength. Another fight is about strategy or quick thinking or using someone's power against them, and then another fight is there for comedic relief. Like you see in Alabasta, Oda tries to make each fight feel different from the other ones. In Jujutsu Kaisen, you get all these insane fights with different abilities, but they have fairly similar vibes to them. Which is why I would argue that this is where the whole Jujutsu Kaisen is just about fights thing comes from. Because if the fights really do feel so similar as I'm claiming, then it kinda makes sense that people would complain that you just get more of the same thing. Now, another element that goes into the matchups is the build-up, which obviously deserves its own discussion. But before we get into that, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. So when it comes to build-up, one thing we have to acknowledge is that One Piece has the advantage of time. For example, let's take Luffy versus Doflamingo. This guy Doflamingo was carefully set up over hundreds of chapters even before there was any hint of him fighting Luffy. You're just not gonna get that in fights in Jujutsu Kaisen. Sure, you'll get it for say Gojo versus Sukuna, but nothing else comes close to the kind of stuff you'll see in One Piece. So just by default, there is that sort of bias just by One Piece being a much older story. But even when you take that factor out of the picture, the fact of the matter is that Oda puts more time into slowly building up fights than Gege does. Again, Jujutsu Kaisen is largely a series that consists of battle royales. So while you do have fights like Gojo versus Toji that had build up over the course of that whole arc, for the most part, a lot of the fights are kind of one and done. Like, two characters will meet, duke it out for a couple of chapters, and then that's it. But in One Piece, often what you will see is multiple rounds to a broader fight. For example, to go back to Alabasta, Luffy had to fight Crocodile 3 times. Once in the desert, once at the castle, and then one final time in the ruins. So while you get 3 fights that all play out differently, you also get 2 fights that build suspense as you approach that final fight where Crocodile is pushed to his limit. It creates more suspense and also a much more meaningful rivalry than you can expect in a random battle royale matchup. And like I said before, this also ties into payoff because once these kinds of fights finally end, you're getting the finale to a fight that's likely been built up to for at least 30 to 50 chapters. Now, admittedly, this isn't a perfect formula, because on the one hand, Jujutsu Kaisen fights might feel random, but they're very fast and very intense, so you're kinda just like boom 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 one fight to another. One Piece fights can kinda drag on, and because some fights will have multiple rounds or matches, you run into the all too familiar trope of, oh well, now I gotta do some training. Jujutsu Kaisen has training, but it doesn't take up nearly as much of the story as One Piece does. But on the other hand, when you finally get to these fights, you get a ton of payoff. And we've talked about different kinds of payoff, like impact on characters, or rewarding readers for investing in 30 to 50 long arcs. But probably the biggest payoff to these fights is seeing how everything Oda has layered into a fight comes together. And this gets us into another thing Oda does better than Gege, namely writing fights that have more depth. And before you misquote me, let me just be clear. No, I am not saying fights in Jujutsu Kaisen don't have depth. If anything, the final fights have shown that there's plenty of depth. But Oda goes above and beyond. For example, you might be familiar with the One Piece and Dragon Ball comparison. How, for example, in Dragon Ball, characters will fight in gorgeous backgrounds, but those backgrounds mainly serve an aesthetic function. One Piece, on the other hand, will usually have fights where the scenery adds another layer to the meaning of the fight. For example, one of my all-time favorite fights in manga is Luffy versus Katakuri. In that fight, the two characters fight in the Mirror world, a world where you are surrounded by mirrors everywhere you go, which serves as an analogy to the fact that Katakuri has created a persona for himself and is always being watched by his family, in this case, quite literally. So during the fight, the two characters are always being watched. That's a layer of depth that you rarely see in Jujutsu Kaisen. Another thing we see more often in One Piece is how villains will change over the course of the fight. So in our Katakuri example, Katakuri seems like a very stoic character who is completely unfazable. But over the course of the fight, we slowly start to see Katakuri break down. And then when Luffy is injured and Katakuri injures himself to even the fight, we see that Katakuri has changed from needing to rely on this persona to being able to let loose and not be tied down by his family-imposed responsibilities. Katakuri has a layered and complete character arc that takes place over the entire fight, something that can obviously be seen in Jujutsu Kaisen as well, but not as often as you see with villains in One Piece. And then of course, you have other layers to the fights, like how the fight ties into and develops the central theme of each arc, how those themes contribute to the broader ongoing themes of the story, the emotional investment we have in these fights, like when Luffy saves Robin, or Sanji lets himself get captured so that Robin can have a chance to show how strong she is, or when Usopp fights Luffy knowing he's going to lose because he wants to stand up for his beliefs. All examples that you can definitely find in Jujutsu Kaisen, just not to the extent that you'll find in One Piece. And that is generally what One Piece does better than Jujutsu Kaisen. I think we can all agree that when it comes to technical elements like paneling and choreography, One Piece doesn't come close to Jujutsu Kaisen. For that reason, Jujutsu Kaisen fights are much more intense. But One Piece fights have a certain level of heart to them that resonates with fans in a special way. This is because the fights are often built up to over several volumes. They usually consist of many different layers that make for more meaningful fights. And there's all kinds of payoffs like emotional scenes, elevation of characters, impact on the world, and so much more. This is why, as incredible as Jujutsu Kaisen's fights are, they'll never be quite as special as the fights in One Piece. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate the fights in One Piece? How do they compare to Jujutsu Kaisen's fights? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, in that video I analyze One Piece's artistic evolution. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.